Why Cayce concealed the truth about the 7 weeks after death. There exists a truth so profound, so transformative in its implications, that one of history's most documented psychics chose to keep it hidden from the world. Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, the man who could peer beyond the veil of death itself, deliberately concealed his most powerful discovery about what happens in the 7 weeks immediately following our final breath. Picture this: a man gifted with the ability to witness the soul's journey beyond physical death, choosing silence over revelation. A consciousness that could access the deepest mysteries of existence, yet speaking in riddles and coded language when approached about humanity's greatest unknown. What truth about the afterlife was so dangerous and so potentially shattering to our understanding of death that Cayce felt compelled to protect us from it? In his most sacred readings about death and transition, researchers have found something unsettling: deliberate omissions, sentences that trail off into silence, moments where the great psychic's voice would soften, then stop entirely, as if he'd encountered knowledge too weighty for human ears. The coded language is there if you know how to look. Reading 136:18, where Cayce's words become deliberately obscure. Reading 254:68, where his voice drops to a whisper when describing the soul's first week beyond the body. Reading 5-7-5-6-14, where he speaks of knowledge that could shatter faith or create dangerous obsession with death. This wasn't censorship. This was spiritual protection. Tonight, you'll understand not only what Cayce discovered about the critical 49-day period following death, but why he believed humanity wasn't ready for this knowledge. You'll learn about the soul's most vulnerable window, the choices that determine eternal trajectory, and the dangerous power that the living hold over those who have just crossed the threshold. This forbidden wisdom could fundamentally change how we prepare for death, how we honor the dying process, and how we understand our role in the soul's eternal journey. But first, you must understand why some truths are too sacred to speak aloud. Edgar Cayce lived with a burden that few could comprehend. His consciousness could slip beyond the boundaries of physical existence, witnessing truths about life, death, and the soul's journey that stretched far beyond human understanding. Yet with this gift came an unexpected dilemma. The deeper Cayce traveled into the mysteries of existence, the more he realized that some knowledge carried the weight of spiritual dynamite. Information so powerful that sharing it carelessly could create more harm than healing, more confusion than clarity. Those closest to Cayce knew of his inner struggle. He would emerge from readings pale and shaken, speaking quietly to his wife Gertrude about visions too profound for public consumption. He confided in his secretary Gladys Davis about receiving information that felt too dangerous to release into unprepared minds. This pattern appears throughout his work, but nowhere more distinctly than in his readings about death and the afterlife. When asked about what happens immediately after physical death, Cayce's usual clarity would give way to careful, measured language. His typical direct answers would become wrapped in symbolism and metaphor. Where he usually provided specific guidance, he would offer only gentle suggestions wrapped in protective ambiguity. Reading 136:18 stands as a perfect example. A grieving mother asks Cayce to describe her son's experience in the first days after his passing. Cayce begins with his characteristic detail, then his voice becomes distant, cautious. He speaks of adjustments that must remain private to the soul and choices too sacred for earthly understanding. Why would a man dedicated to helping humanity suddenly become evasive about our most fundamental concern? Because Edgar Cayce had discovered something extraordinary about the 49-day period following death, something that challenged every assumption about the afterlife. something that revealed the profound vulnerability of transitioning souls and the unexpected power held by those still living. He had glimpsed the truth behind the soul's most critical passage and realized that this knowledge, in the wrong hands or unprepared minds, could create spiritual chaos rather than spiritual healing. In the sacred traditions of many cultures, the number 49 holds mystical significance. 7 weeks, 7 times, 7 days. A complete cycle of spiritual transformation. But for Edgar Cayce, this wasn't merely symbolic. Through his psychic explorations, he discovered that the 49 days following physical death represent the soul's most crucial transition period, a window of time when the essence of who we are undergoes its most fundamental transformation. This isn't simply an adjustment period, as many spiritual teachings suggest. It's not a passive waiting time before judgment or a gentle floating toward the light. According to Cayce's hidden revelations, these 7 weeks represent an intensely active period of conscious choice-making, a time when the soul must make decisions that will determine not just its immediate destination, but its capacity for future incarnations, its level of spiritual service, and its eternal trajectory. Think of it as the soul's graduation ceremony, where final exams determine not just passing or failing, but which university of existence the soul will attend next. During these 49 days, the soul exists in a state unlike any other in its eternal journey, free from the physical body's limitations, yet not fully integrated into its new spiritual reality, conscious and aware, yet profoundly vulnerable to influence and suggestion. Cayce discovered that what happens during these 7 weeks ripples outward through time and space, affecting not just the individual soul, but entire family lines, soul groups, and spiritual connections across multiple dimensions of existence. The choices made during this sacred portal determine whether a soul ascends to higher service, returns quickly to physical incarnation, or becomes trapped in confused states between worlds. But here's what made Cayce's discovery so potentially dangerous. These choices aren't made in isolation. The thoughts, prayers, emotions, and intentions of living people can actually influence the soul's decision-making process during this critical window. The grieving process isn't just about healing for the living, it's about spiritual support or spiritual interference for the dead. Picture Edgar Cayce, deep in psychic trance, his consciousness following a recently departed soul through the first moments of its afterlife journey. What he witnessed challenged every religious doctrine, every comfortable assumption about death and the hereafter. The soul didn't simply go to heaven or face divine judgment. It didn't float peacefully toward a bright light or settle into eternal rest. Instead, Cayce observed something far more complex and profound. The soul entered what he privately described as the Great Choosing Time, a period of unprecedented spiritual activity where fundamental decisions about eternal existence had to be made. But these weren't choices imposed by external forces. They weren't decisions made by divine beings or determined by past karma alone. They were active, conscious choices made by the soul itself. Choices that could be influenced by the living. In reading after reading, Cayce witnessed souls in the early days, after death existing in a state of extraordinary suggestibility. Their usual protective barriers dissolved. Their consciousness expanded beyond individual identity. They became remarkably receptive to the thoughts and intentions projected toward them from the physical realm. A grieving spouse's desperate pleas for the departed not to leave could actually create confusion in the transitioning soul, causing it to resist its natural progression toward higher states of consciousness. A family's collective fear about the afterlife could influence the soul's perception of its spiritual options, limiting its awareness of higher possibilities. Conversely, conscious prayers of release and blessing could support the soul in making its highest choices, elevating its transition to levels of spiritual service and evolution that might not otherwise be accessible. This discovery shook Cayce to his core. It meant that death wasn't a private, individual experience. It was a collaborative process between the living and the dead, and most people on Earth had no idea they were participating in it. The implications were staggering and terrifying. If people knew about their power to influence departing souls, how might they use it? Would grieving families try to hold their loved ones back from spiritual evolution? Would spiritual practitioners attempt to direct souls toward specific destinations? Would the knowledge create obsessive behaviors that trapped both the living and the dead in unhealthy attachments? Cayce realized he had stumbled upon spiritual knowledge that required tremendous maturity and wisdom to handle responsibly. Knowledge that could transform grief into sacred service or turn it into spiritual manipulation. This was why he began speaking in codes and metaphors when discussing the 49-day transition. Not to hide truth from humanity, but to protect humanity from truth it wasn't prepared to handle wisely. Deep in reading 25468, Edgar Cayce's voice grows soft as he describes what he calls the soul's time of great openness. He speaks carefully, choosing each word like a surgeon selecting instruments for delicate operation. What Cayce had discovered was perhaps the most carefully guarded secret in all spiritual knowledge. During the 49-day transition period, the soul exists in a state of unprecedented vulnerability. Imagine, if you will, a butterfly emerging from its cocoon. In those first moments, its wings are soft, malleable, susceptible to even the gentlest touch. The slightest disturbance can affect the formation of wings that will carry it through its entire flying existence. The soul's 49-day journey operates on similar principles. Freed from the physical body's protective barriers, the transitioning soul's consciousness expands exponentially. It becomes capable of perceiving multiple dimensions simultaneously, of accessing vast libraries of spiritual knowledge, of connecting with guides and teachers from higher realms. But this expanded awareness comes with a price. The soul becomes remarkably sensitive to the thoughts, emotions, and intentions directed toward it from the physical plane. During Cayce's trance states, he repeatedly witnessed how the mental and emotional energy of living people could actually alter a soul's perception of its spiritual options. A mother's intense grief could create the impression in her departed child's consciousness that leaving would cause unbearable pain. A spouse's angry demands for the deceased to come back could generate confusion about whether forward movement was permitted or even possible. These weren't temporary influences. Cayce observed that the impressions received during the 49-day window could affect the soul's choices about its entire spiritual trajectory. A soul influenced toward earthly attachment during this vulnerable period might choose rapid reincarnation rather than the spiritual education and service available in higher dimensions. A soul receiving conflicted messages about its worth might select challenging incarnations as perceived punishment rather than embracing opportunities for joyful service. Most disturbing of all, Cayce witnessed souls becoming so confused by the emotional chaos projected from grieving loved ones that they remained trapped in between-world states, unable to move forward into their spiritual evolution, yet unable to return to physical existence. This knowledge terrified Cayce, not because the influence was inherently negative, but because it existed without most people's awareness or consent. Families were unknowingly participating in their loved ones' eternal destiny choices. The grieving process had profound spiritual implications that extended far beyond emotional healing for the living. But perhaps most challenging of all, this meant that learning to grieve consciously, to love without attachment, to release without abandoning, these weren't just personal healing practices. They were acts of spiritual service that could literally determine another soul's eternal trajectory. Such knowledge demanded tremendous spiritual maturity, and Cayce wasn't certain humanity possessed it. During some of his deepest trance states exploring the death transition, Edgar Cayce encountered something unexpected. Spiritual beings of extraordinary wisdom and compassion appeared to guide his consciousness and to warn him about the consequences of revealing certain information prematurely. These weren't the familiar guides who typically assisted in his healing readings. These beings emanated an authority and concern that made even Cayce's expanded consciousness feel small and receptive. In private notes that Gladys Davis would later transcribe, Cayce described these encounters with a mixture of awe and trepidation. Teachers of teachers, he called them, guardians of sacred knowledge who understand the weight of truth better than those who seek it. The message they conveyed was both simple and profound. Some spiritual knowledge carries the power to liberate or destroy, depending entirely on the consciousness that receives it. They explained to Cayce that knowledge about post-death influence had been carefully guarded throughout human history, precisely because of its potential for misuse. In the wrong hands, such information could create spiritual chaos rather than spiritual evolution. They showed Cayce visions of possible futures where the knowledge was released too early. He witnessed grieving families becoming obsessed with controlling their loved ones' afterlife experiences, turning death into a power struggle rather than a sacred release. He saw spiritual practitioners using their understanding of soul vulnerability to manipulate transitioning consciousness for personal or organizational gain. Most tragically, he observed souls becoming trapped in prolonged confusion as multiple living people projected conflicting intentions toward them during their vulnerable 49-day window. But the guides also showed Cayce the potential benefits of the knowledge when received by spiritually mature consciousness. They revealed how conscious grieving could become a form of sacred service, supporting souls in making their highest evolutionary choices. They demonstrated how proper understanding of the 49-day transition could transform humanity's entire relationship with death and dying. The key was timing and readiness. These protective beings weren't advocating for permanent secrecy. They were guardians of evolutionary timing, ensuring that powerful spiritual tools were released only when human consciousness had developed the wisdom to use them beneficially. They impressed upon Cayce that his role wasn't just to channel spiritual information, but to serve as a filter and protector of that information, to preserve the knowledge in forms that could be accessed by those spiritually prepared to receive it, while protecting those who weren't ready from its potentially harmful effects. This was why Cayce began embedding the most crucial information about the 49-day transition in coded language, symbolic imagery, and carefully constructed metaphors. The truth was there for those prepared to receive it, but veiled enough to prevent casual misuse. It wasn't deception, it was spiritual protection in its highest form. In reading 57-5-6-14, Edgar Cayce's voice takes on an almost reverent quality as he describes what he calls the three great decisions that determine eternity. But as he begins to elaborate, his language becomes increasingly symbolic, wrapped in protective metaphor. Through careful analysis of multiple readings and Cayce's private notes, researchers have pieced together what he discovered about the soul's three fundamental choices during the 49-day transition period. Choices so consequential that Cayce felt they were too weighty for unprepared minds to contemplate. The first choice concerns consciousness itself. During the early weeks of transition, the soul determines its level of spiritual expansion or contraction based on its integration of earthly experiences. Imagine the soul as a vessel that has been filled with the waters of human experience. During the 49-day period, it must decide whether to expand that vessel to hold greater spiritual capacity, or contract it to focus on familiar patterns and comfortable limitations. Souls that choose expansion open themselves to unprecedented spiritual education, service opportunities, and evolutionary acceleration. They become available for higher forms of spiritual work, teaching responsibilities, and multi-dimensional service. Souls that choose contraction often return quickly to physical incarnation, sometimes carrying forward unresolved patterns that create repetitive life experiences until expansion becomes unavoidable. But here's what made this choice particularly dangerous knowledge. The soul's decision about expansion or contraction could be heavily influenced by the expectations and projections of living loved ones. Families who couldn't imagine their departed loved one in expanded spiritual roles might unconsciously encourage contraction. People who placed the deceased on pedestals might create pressure toward expansion that the soul wasn't genuinely ready to embrace. The second critical choice involves the soul's relationship to earthly concerns. During the middle weeks of the 49-day period, the soul determines whether to maintain connection to physical plane issues or release into complete spiritual focus. This isn't about forgetting earthly loved ones or abandoning compassionate concern for their well-being. It's about the soul's primary orientation, whether its consciousness remains partially anchored in earthly dynamics or becomes fully available for spiritual service. Souls that choose continued earthly connection often become guides and guardians for their living families, but this role can limit their own spiritual advancement and sometimes creates unhealthy dependencies between the living and the dead. Souls that choose complete spiritual release become available for teaching, healing, and service roles that benefit much larger groups of beings across multiple planes of existence. Again, this choice could be powerfully influenced by the living. Families that clung desperately to their departed loved ones could unconsciously pressure souls toward continued earthly connection, potentially limiting their spiritual evolution for generations. The third and most consequential choice occurs during the final weeks of the 49-day period. The soul determines its relationship to future incarnations and its trajectory for continued existence. Some souls choose rapid return to physical life, driven by unfinished business, intense earthly attachments, or simple preference for familiar physical existence. Others choose extended periods in spiritual education dimensions, focusing on healing, learning, and preparation for future service incarnations. Still others choose ascension beyond the need for physical incarnation entirely, moving into teaching and guidance roles that serve the evolution of multiple planetary systems. But Cayce discovered that the soul's awareness of these options could be dramatically affected by the beliefs and expectations of living people during the critical choosing period. This third choice was perhaps the most carefully concealed aspect of Cayce's revelations, because it meant that how families grieved, what they expected for their loved ones' spiritual futures, and how they held the balance between love and release could literally determine whether a soul ascended to its highest potential or became trapped in limiting patterns for multiple lifetimes. Such knowledge demanded extraordinary spiritual maturity. It required the ability to love without possessing, to support without controlling, to grieve without clinging. Cayce wasn't certain humanity was ready for such responsibility. Perhaps the most carefully guarded aspect of Edgar Cayce's discoveries about the 49-day transition was how profoundly it affected not just the individual soul, but entire networks of spiritual connection spanning generations and dimensions. In reading 294-189, Cayce describes what he privately termed the Great Interconnection, but his public language remains vague, speaking only of influences that extend beyond individual experience and connections that bind souls across time and space. What Cayce had actually witnessed was far more specific and far more consequential. Every choice made by a soul during its 49-day transition creates karmic ripples that affect its entire soul group, its family line extending both backward and forward in time, and its connections to other evolving consciousness across multiple planetary systems. Picture a vast web of golden light connecting every soul that has ever shared love, conflict, learning, or service. When one soul successfully navigates its post-death transition, choosing expansion, spiritual release, and evolutionary advancement, it sends waves of elevated energy throughout the entire network. These ripples can actually assist other souls in making similar high choices during their own transition periods. They can provide healing and resolution for ancestral patterns that have created limitation across multiple generations. They can even influence the spiritual preparation of souls, planning future incarnations within the family line. But the reverse is equally true. A soul that becomes confused, trapped, or limited during its 49-day journey creates ripples of limitation throughout its connection network. These can manifest as repeated family patterns of difficult death experiences, spiritual confusion in subsequent generations, or karmic obstacles that affect multiple soul group members for centuries. Most remarkably, Cayce observed that the quality of support provided by living family members during a soul's transition period could affect the spiritual trajectory of children not yet born into the family line. Conscious, loving release of a departed soul could establish patterns of spiritual freedom that would benefit descendants for multiple generations. Possessive, fearful clinging could create limiting beliefs about death and spirituality that would challenge family members across centuries. This discovery added an entirely new dimension to Cayce's understanding of why the 49-day knowledge was so carefully protected by higher spiritual authorities. It meant that how humanity handled death and dying wasn't just a personal or even family matter. It was a collective spiritual responsibility that affected the evolution of consciousness on a planetary scale. Every funeral, every grieving process, every family's response to death was contributing to either humanity's spiritual advancement or its limitation. But most people had no awareness of this responsibility. They grieved naturally, expressed their attachment and fear instinctively, and projected their beliefs and expectations unconsciously. If people knew about the ripple effects of their responses to death, how would they change their behavior? Would families feel overwhelming pressure to grieve correctly for the sake of future generations? Would the knowledge create spiritual performance anxiety that interfered with natural grieving processes? Or could humanity mature into conscious participation in this sacred responsibility, transforming death from humanity's greatest fear into its greatest opportunity for collective spiritual service? Cayce preserved this knowledge in the most carefully coded language of all his readings, trusting that when humanity was ready for such profound responsibility, the wisdom would become accessible to those prepared to handle it with appropriate reverence and skill. In the depths of reading 262-85, Edgar Cayce's voice becomes almost inaudible as he describes what he calls the sacred participation of those who remain. Even his closest associates noted that this particular reading left him emotionally shaken, speaking afterwards of responsibilities too great for unprepared hearts. What Cayce had discovered was perhaps the most transformative and potentially dangerous aspect of the 49-day transition. The living don't simply mourn the dead. They actively participate in determining the dead's spiritual future. Through prayer, meditation, conscious intention, and even unconscious emotional projection, those on earth can assist souls in making their highest evolutionary choices during the critical transition period. But this same power can also hinder, confuse, or trap departed souls if exercised possessively, ignorantly, or without proper spiritual understanding. Imagine discovering that your thoughts about your deceased loved one aren't just personal grief expressions. They're actually telepathic communications that can influence that soul's eternal trajectory. That your prayers aren't just comforting rituals. They're powerful spiritual technologies that can assist or interfere with consciousness at its most vulnerable moment. During his trance explorations, Cayce repeatedly observed how specific types of mental and emotional energy from living people affected transitioning souls in predictable ways. Thoughts of unconditional love and blessing consistently supported souls in choosing their highest spiritual options, expanding their consciousness, and embracing advanced service opportunities. Prayers specifically requesting the soul's highest good, without attachment to specific outcomes, created protective energy fields that helped departing consciousness navigate complex spiritual choices with clarity and wisdom. Meditation practices that held the departed soul in light, while consciously releasing it from earthly obligations, provided crucial support for souls choosing spiritual advancement over rapid reincarnation. But Cayce also witnessed how other common responses to death could create spiritual obstacles for transitioning souls. Desperate pleas for the deceased to come back or don't leave me generated confusion in souls trying to determine whether forward spiritual movement was appropriate or permitted. Intense guilt about the relationship with the deceased created energetic interference that could cloud the soul's perception of its spiritual options and worthiness for evolutionary advancement. Family conflicts about the deceased person's beliefs or spiritual choices projected contradictory expectations that sometimes trapped souls in between-world states, unable to choose any direction due to the conflicting influences. Most challenging of all, Cayce observed how possessive love, the kind that says you belong to me rather than I celebrate your freedom, could actually prevent souls from accessing their highest spiritual potentials, keeping them earthbound in service to family attachment rather than universal service. This knowledge could transform grief into sacred spiritual practice. It could turn mourning into conscious service. It could make every death an opportunity for both the living and the dead to experience unprecedented spiritual growth. But it also meant that grieving families carried a spiritual responsibility they never consented to and probably weren't prepared to handle wisely. How do you tell someone who has just lost their beloved that their natural expressions of grief might be interfering with that person's spiritual evolution? How do you educate people about conscious dying and conscious grieving without creating spiritual performance anxiety that interferes with authentic emotional processing? How do you balance the need for emotional healing among the living with the need for spiritual freedom among the dead? These questions haunted Cayce. He saw how this knowledge could liberate both the living and the dead from unconscious patterns that limited spiritual growth for all involved. But he also saw how it could become another form of spiritual tyranny, with families policing each other's grief responses and individuals suppressing natural emotions in service to perceived spiritual obligations. The knowledge demanded extraordinary emotional maturity, spiritual wisdom, and unconditional love. It required the ability to serve without controlling, to love without possessing, to participate without interfering. Edgar Cayce wasn't certain humanity possessed such sophisticated spiritual skills, but he preserved the knowledge, carefully encoded in symbolic language, trusting that when human consciousness developed sufficient maturity, this wisdom would become available to transform humanity's relationship with death, dying, and the sacred transition of consciousness from one realm of existence to another. Now that you understand what Edgar Cayce concealed about the 49-day transition, you face the same dilemma that haunted the sleeping prophet himself. How does one handle sacred knowledge responsibly? This isn't theoretical wisdom. This is practical spiritual technology that affects real souls making real choices about their eternal existence. But with this understanding comes the need for extraordinary maturity, wisdom, and love. First, recognize that knowledge of the soul's post-death vulnerability isn't an invitation to control or direct another being's spiritual choices. It's an opportunity to serve without attachment to outcomes. When someone you love is making their transition, your role isn't to determine what choices they should make about expansion, earthly connection, or future incarnation. Your role is to create energetic conditions that support their highest decision-making without interference or manipulation. This means learning to love in a completely new way. Love that celebrates freedom rather than demanding connection. Love that trusts the wisdom of another soul's journey rather than insisting on specific outcomes. Love that serves evolution rather than attachment. Practically, this translates into specific approaches to grief and mourning that Cayce would recognize as spiritually mature. Send unconditional love to those in transition, but consciously release any expectations about how that love should influence their spiritual choices. Pray for their highest good, their greatest spiritual evolution, their deepest fulfillment, without defining what those outcomes should look like. Hold them in light during meditation, but visualize that light as supportive rather than directive. A warm spiritual environment that enhances their decision-making clarity rather than pushing them toward particular choices. Most importantly, use your awareness of their spiritual vulnerability to examine and transform your own attachments, fears, and possessive tendencies. Every impulse to hold on to your departed loved one becomes an opportunity to practice spiritual release. Every fear about their afterlife experience becomes a chance to develop trust in the wisdom of the soul's journey. Every desire to control their spiritual trajectory becomes an invitation to mature into unconditional service. This knowledge also demands that you begin preparing consciously for your own 49-day journey, understanding that you'll exist in a state of expanded awareness but increased vulnerability during that transition period can motivate profound spiritual preparation during your physical lifetime. Develop the ability to make choices based on spiritual wisdom rather than fear or attachment. Practice releasing possessive relationships now while you have physical incarnation as a learning environment. Cultivate trust in the benevolent intelligence that orchestrates spiritual evolution across multiple dimensions. Most importantly, prepare your loved ones to support your transition consciously when the time comes. Share this knowledge carefully, lovingly, with those who demonstrate readiness to handle it maturely. Help them understand that their grief responses will affect your spiritual options during your vulnerable transition period. But remember, this preparation serves love, not control. You're not trying to manipulate your future transition experience. You're creating conditions that will support your own highest choices when you exist in a state of expanded spiritual awareness. The ultimate wisdom Edgar Cayce embedded in his concealed teachings about death is this: conscious participation in the dying process, both as the one dying and as those supporting the transition. can transform humanity's greatest fear into its most profound opportunity for spiritual service. Death becomes not an ending, but a graduation ceremony where every participant, both the transitioning soul and those who remain, has the opportunity to demonstrate their highest spiritual development. This is why Cayce preserved this knowledge despite its potential for misuse. He trusted that when humanity developed sufficient spiritual maturity, this wisdom would serve the evolution of consciousness in ways that casual revelation never could. Your readiness to receive and contemplate this information responsibly is itself evidence of humanity's growing spiritual sophistication. Perhaps you're wondering why any spiritual knowledge would be deliberately withheld, why truth would be concealed even from sincere seekers who genuinely desire understanding. This question goes to the heart of spiritual wisdom and responsible teaching. Imagine giving a loaded weapon to a child, or providing the keys to a powerful vehicle to someone who has never learned to drive. The tool itself isn't evil, but without proper preparation, maturity, and training, it becomes dangerous rather than helpful. Spiritual knowledge operates on similar principles. Edgar Cayce's concealment of the 49-day secrets wasn't about creating spiritual elite who hoarded truth while keeping others ignorant. It was about protecting both the living and the dead from knowledge that could cause harm when received by unprepared consciousness. Consider the psychological impact of learning that your grief responses affect your loved one's eternal trajectory. For someone without spiritual maturity, this knowledge could create unbearable guilt, spiritual performance anxiety, or obsessive attempts to grieve correctly that actually interfere with natural healing processes. Consider the potential for spiritual manipulation if people knew they could influence departing souls during the vulnerable transition period. Unscrupulous individuals might attempt to direct souls toward specific spiritual destinations for personal gain, or families might try to prevent their loved ones from choosing spiritual advancement that would limit their availability as guides and guardians. Most tragically, consider how this knowledge could transform natural death experiences into power struggles with multiple living people projecting conflicting intentions toward confused transitioning souls, trapping them in between world states for extended periods. Cayce understood that some spiritual wisdom requires specific levels of consciousness and emotional development to handle safely and beneficially. This isn't spiritual elitism, it's developmental wisdom. Just as you wouldn't teach advanced mathematics to someone who hasn't mastered basic arithmetic, certain spiritual knowledge requires foundation experiences, emotional maturity, and developed spiritual capacities to be received safely. But notice that the knowledge wasn't destroyed or permanently hidden. Cayce preserved it in coded form, embedded in symbolic language that would become accessible to those who developed the spiritual sophistication to decode it responsibly. This approach honors both the power of truth and the wisdom of appropriate timing. It makes advanced spiritual knowledge available to those prepared to use it beneficially while protecting those who aren't ready from its potentially harmful effects. Your ability to receive and contemplate this information about the 49-day transition without becoming obsessed, manipulative, or overwhelmed indicates your readiness to handle spiritual wisdom responsibly. But with this readiness comes responsibility. Use this understanding to deepen your own spiritual development rather than attempting to control others' death experiences. Apply it to examine and transform your own attachments and fears rather than directing other people's spiritual choices. Most importantly, recognize that being entrusted with formerly concealed wisdom makes you a guardian of that knowledge, responsible for sharing it only with others who demonstrate similar spiritual maturity and genuine readiness to handle it lovingly. The concealment itself serves spiritual evolution, ensuring that powerful wisdom reaches receptive consciousness at appropriate developmental moments rather than creating chaos through premature revelation. This is how truth serves both power and protection, making transformation available while honoring the sacred timing of spiritual awakening. There's a profound temptation that comes with understanding your power to influence transitioning souls, the impulse to use that knowledge to maintain connection with those you cannot bear to release. This impulse is entirely natural, born from love and the deep human need for continuity of relationship. But Edgar Cayce's concealed wisdom about the 49-day transition includes a crucial understanding about the nature of love itself. True love serves the beloved's highest evolution, even when that evolution requires separation from familiar connections. Possessive love, no matter how sincere, creates spiritual obstacles that can limit a soul's access to its greatest potentials for service, growth, and fulfillment. When you discover that your thoughts and prayers can actually affect a departed loved one's spiritual choices, your first impulse might be to use that influence to keep them close, to ensure they remain available to guide and comfort you during your own earthly journey. But Cayce's hidden teachings reveal that such influence, even when motivated by love, can trap souls in limiting patterns that prevent them from accessing their highest spiritual destinies. Picture a child who has the opportunity to attend an extraordinary school that will develop their unique talents and prepare them for meaningful service in the world. But that school is far from home, requiring the child to live independently and develop self-reliance. Parents who truly love that child will support their enrollment despite their own pain at the separation. Parents who cannot release their attachment might unconsciously sabotage the opportunity, keeping the child close but limiting their potential for growth and contribution. The soul's 49-day transition operates on similar principles but with stakes that extend across multiple lifetimes and dimensions of existence. A soul that has the opportunity to advance into teaching, healing, or service roles that benefit thousands of other beings might be prevented from accepting such positions by the unconscious clinging of earthly family members. A soul that could ascend beyond the need for repeated physical incarnations might choose to return quickly to Earth in order to remain available to loved ones who cannot bear the thought of permanent separation. These aren't necessarily wrong choices. Every soul has the right to prioritize earthly connections over advanced spiritual service, but when such choices are made due to energetic pressure from the living rather than the soul's own authentic preferences, they represent a form of spiritual limitation that affects everyone involved. The living remain dependent on external sources of guidance and comfort, rather than developing their own spiritual capabilities. The dead remain constrained in roles that may no longer serve their highest evolution. Everyone becomes trapped in patterns that limit growth and spiritual advancement. Cayce's concealed wisdom about sacred boundaries isn't about abandoning your love for departed souls or pretending that separation doesn't cause pain. It's about loving in a way that serves everyone's highest development. This means consciously releasing your departed loved ones to make whatever spiritual choices will best serve their eternal journey, even if those choices create more distance than your heart would prefer. It means transforming your grief from clinging energy that asks, "Don't leave me," into blessing energy that says, "May you fulfill your highest spiritual potential." It means using your knowledge of your influence over transitioning souls to support their freedom rather than their continued availability to serve your emotional needs. This kind of love requires tremendous spiritual maturity. It asks you to place another being's spiritual evolution above your own emotional comfort. It requires faith that what serves their highest good will ultimately serve the highest good of all involved, even when the immediate experience is painful. But this mature love also creates profound spiritual freedom for everyone involved. When departed souls are released to pursue their highest spiritual potentials, they become capable of serving their earthly loved ones in far more powerful and beneficial ways than would be possible through possessive connection. When living people learn to love without clinging, they develop spiritual independence and capabilities that serve them throughout their own incarnations and beyond. The sacred boundaries that Cayce embedded in his concealed teachings aren't limitations on love. They're invitations to love so purely and powerfully that everyone touched by that love becomes more free, more capable, and more able to serve the evolution of consciousness throughout multiple dimensions of existence. Your willingness to honor these boundaries demonstrates spiritual love in its highest form. As our journey through Edgar Cayce's concealed wisdom draws toward completion, we arrive at perhaps his most profound insight about why certain spiritual knowledge must remain hidden until humanity develops the consciousness to receive it safely. Cayce realized that the concealment itself serves humanity's spiritual evolution. This wasn't about withholding truth from deserving seekers or creating artificial scarcity around spiritual wisdom. It was about recognizing that the organic development of consciousness requires that wisdom and power emerge together at appropriate developmental stages.